think 5 o'clock right on the money right now, but given we all had to walk about 2 miles to get here, we'll forgive a few stragglers that come in here. While we're waiting, why don't I just ask a few questions? How many here have, I don't know where I should stand, maybe over here more. How many here have heard about SQL Server appliances? Have some knowledge of them, okay. How many have heard about them before this conference? Okay. How many folks here are, you would classify yourselves more on the DBA side? And how many on the more on the IT admin side? So mix of folks. Good. Good. Well, why don't we get started then? My name is Britt Johnston, and with me is Dana Kaufman. We both work on what we call the appliance engineering team, which is part of the core engineering group at Microsoft that works on SQL Server and the family of SQL Server related technologies. We got into this really because of a lot of experiences that we've had in the field and interacting with customers. So it'll be fun to kind of share that with you all as we go through this. First thing I want to do, and actually one of the most common questions I get, is why would I want to use an appliance? And so we'll talk about that a little bit. And then I want to go into our roadmap and where we stand on that. What's available today, what's coming soon, what's in the future. Talk a little bit about all the future appliances that we have. And then finally go in specifically into the business decision appliance, which we actually physically have here. We have on the show floor. And it's a great example that we can look at of what an appliance experience is about. And so it's a good, we'll say, prototype to use about the concept. So why appliances? You know, it really occurred to me, it was probably more like 3 years ago, that we were reaching a point where our ability as an engineering team to generate new ideas, concepts, features, abilities in the products was really outpacing the ability of a lot of our customers to incorporate them into their own world. And of course, that's not everybody, but it's very difficult to maintain your existing infrastructure and also incorporate all the new things that come along. And one thought about how to lessen that gap, if you will, would be to start delivering products in a different way. Deliver products rather than focusing on completely general purpose piece of software, which took a lot of system integration work on the part of our customers, understand workloads and build appliances that were specific to those to solve many of the problems that we see that are out there. It's very common for large organizations or small to have standard servers or standard, and even going beyond that, standard database servers. If you're in a big enough organization, you'll have standard data warehouses or data marts, and so that specialization starts to occur. And when we look, while from the perspective of the individual IT organizations, those solutions look very unique, it turns out across the industry, if we look across many customers, there's a lot of commonality in there. And it's not a surprise. The best way to build certain things actually is common across there. You know, we don't have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 processor servers. We have 2, 4, and 8. And there's a reason why that is. And there's patterns that occur there. And that same kind of pattern can extend itself up into appliances. So the real answer to why appliances is to enable an organization to start with a higher level building block. Not eliminate what they need to do in terms of building the right solutions for their own organizations, but really let them focus on delivering the high value part of that rather than the low value piece of racking servers or just trying to understand how much memory to put in a box, those kinds of questions, because it's very difficult to get the best answer for those unless you make a significant investment in them. And I'll try to walk you through a little bit of the kind of investment we make as part of that, And you can map that maybe to your own experiences. So appliances and really a precursor to them, reference architectures, are a new way to consume complex systems, and we think they're going to continue to expand in terms of the offerings that we have around that. With them, we can condense down, if you will, into some common workloads. We can deliver something that's been pre-optimized by an engineering team that's very close to the software. We can make sure that the support that's delivered to it is very specific to it, so we can potentially go much faster in terms of solutions around support. We can integrate management, and I'll show you an example of that. We can create an architecture that's balanced to try to make sure we don't have a system that's got so much processing power relative to the amount of storage that you can't ever use it for the given workload. And so trying to create those balanced architectures can be complicated. So around this, we have three terms we like to think about in terms of appliances: optimize, agile, and complete. And you can certainly see some of the elements around there of making sure that we focus on a specific workload, provide the complete solution in terms of hardware, software, and services that go with that, and the agility to move faster. The appliance that's there in front of us on the table is operational with a very complex software stack in less than an hour. Most people who are experts at that don't believe that you can actually do that in less than an hour from a standing start. And so the kind of, even for experts, the kind of agility that you can gain, it can be surprising in this. And we'll also try to dive into that a little bit as we go forward. Now, first thing I'd like to talk about is step back a little bit and get into the philosophy around this. And this really is important because one of the things I want to emphasize and make sure you walk away with understanding is the creation of appliances, at least the work that we're doing at Microsoft, is not around identifying a cool piece of hardware and then figuring out what can we do with it. In fact, it's the complete opposite of that. What we do is survey many of our customers, try to see patterns in the workloads that they have. And you can imagine we use those patterns to help us build our software products, but we're also now using those same patterns to understand common workloads and distill out similarities between organizations and how they use software and how they build systems, sometimes very complex systems with high availability, disaster recovery, sometimes multi-phase systems where you've got transaction processing and ETL and data warehousing. Those kinds of patterns are the ones that we're looking to understand. Now, as we gain that understanding, we develop a model for the workload. And what we do at Microsoft is we essentially capture that model in an executable form. So we can simulate that world on solutions that we design. And so, for example, we'll take the appliance in front of us there. We simulated the entire Power Pivot ecosystem and how that operates, and understood deeply what the relationship between processor, storage, and memory, and how to balance all those to provide the optimal solution around that. There's a tremendous amount of investment just to understand the workload and create the automation around that. In fact, that's significant. Most organizations don't go quite to that level of detail in building their own systems. So once we understand in a deep way and have the ability to recreate the workload, we then go look at architectures. We don't assume that the right way to do it is necessarily the way that we've always done it. We want to look at all the options and understand them. And I can give you a great example of this that we'll talk about a little later. When we looked at consolidation, and one of the appliances we'll talk about is a database consolidation appliance or a private cloud, we looked at that solution and understood, wow, there really are a half a dozen different ways that you could consolidate databases. What's the right way? And we studied all those approaches, compared the performance of them, compared how much work it was on behalf of the customer, what kind of isolation occurred between systems. And you can imagine certain ways of consolidating, you lose all your isolation, right? If we start just dumping schemas into the same database, and doing it that way, the isolation between different parts of the system disappears, and now it becomes almost impossible to control the service level for a given subset of that system. And so understanding that is part of that. And that led us to a particular architecture choice around that. Once we understand that architecture, then we can start to look at the software and hardware components that make up the solution. And we're not, in the case, well, we're part of the SQL Server team. The solution generally involves SQL Server. We're not really looking at the workload unless it doesn't, but that doesn't mean it only involves SQL Server. And a couple of the different appliances that we have here really illustrate that. Our business decision appliance, or what I like to call Power Pivot appliance, that really marries SQL Server and SharePoint together. So there's another component in there. In fact, there's a dozen other components in there as part of that solution. For our private cloud, we need to bring in a whole management stack to help us manage at scale hundreds or thousands of SQL Server instances. And so bringing that software stack and identifying them is a task and a significant amount of work. And then we have to understand exactly how all those pieces fit together. What's the right way to configure all those components in the presence of each other and given our particular workload? And so there's a level of work that goes on to understand that. And then finally, we choose a hardware that makes sense. And often that requires understanding deeply the requirements. For example, if we're building the private cloud consolidation, we have to deal with the fact of, okay, we want to use Hyper-V for virtualization. We need to implement a cluster. We need to make sure we can handle the live migration feature. So what does that mean in terms of the requirements on our storage system? And if we want to do guest clusters, what does that mean? And there's all sorts of implications on exactly what you choose and how you implement that to maximize the performance of that underlying system. So those four elements, understanding the workload, choosing an architecture, and then selecting in that context the software and hardware is how we go about that process. And we found we're pretty true to that in this process, and helps guide us down that path. Some quick terminology that I think we all find helpful if we have common terminology, and since this is a new space for many of us, here's some notions that we have here. The database appliance one is pretty obvious, but I say that in case we have people in our audience that don't at all know what we're talking about, and that is the idea is to deliver a hardware-software solution that's pre-packaged, pre-configured, essentially built in the factory, deliver that as a solution, and that's what we consider a database appliance. And we really split them into two categories. What we call Tier 1 appliances, which we consider have a range that includes, it doesn't always have to be, but it includes the large mission-critical workloads. Often those kinds of solutions, as they scale up, that's when they get into those kinds of areas. And then we've got Tier 2 appliances, which are actually most of the workloads in most organizations. It's the workloads that are very important, but it's not like you go out of business if they go offline for an hour. They have usually different service levels, and as a result of that, different requirements in terms of the kinds of systems that you want to build for those. So that's some basic terminology. Anybody have any questions about anything I've done so far? You know, I'll tell you what, to encourage questions, we've got some great posters that talk about some of what we're doing in our appliances. And if you want one, you can ask a question and you'll get one. We have 10 of them. So the first 10 questions get a poster as part of that. So when they come up, you can ask. So let's look at another topic. It's kind of around terminology, but it's a pretty deep concept, and that's the notion of reference architectures. And it's something that we spend a lot more time on these days. Now, in the past, usually reference architectures were delivered in the form of a white paper. And you got those white papers. It really wasn't exactly applicable to what you were doing, but close enough you can infer a few facts, and you did your best. And you tried to adapt it to your own purposes. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is make sure that we keep in mind that the guidance that we publish needs to be generalized enough way and have the dimensions around it specified enough so people can make accurate decisions around that guidance. Now, what that guidance does, though, it doesn't allow you to build a finished solution. What it usually allows you to do is take the first step towards designing your solution on a sound footing. The kind of design that would, if looked at by an expert, they would validate, yep, that's a good approach to doing that. They might have some suggestions on how to tweak it based on their knowledge and the specifics there, but it gives you that guidance, that design guidance, and allows you to create a design. If you take a reference architecture and take it to the next level, that really gets into what we call a vendor-specific reference configuration. And that's when you marry that guidance with a particular approach, a particular collection of hardware. Now, when you get to that reference configuration, you haven't solved the problem yet, but you can buy something now. Now you have, hopefully, a list of all the software components, all the hardware components that are necessary to create what you want, and you can order them. That's often a significant task, getting to the point where you actually are confident that you have all the parts. And the way I like to think about the reference configuration is the end result of that is there a pile of boxes in your shipping area, pile of hardware, pile of software, and you have a high degree of confidence when you assemble them all together correctly, it will work. And so that's often a significant task in and of itself. So reference configurations are very important and something that we're certainly spend some more time on at Microsoft these days, and we'll show you an example of that as we go into our talk a little deeper. The next level of refinement when we get into reference architecture is just creating an appliance product. And that's where we go to the work to not only figure out all the parts, assemble them in a factory, test them to make sure they have the appropriate performance, and so deliver that really as a solution that can be deployed. So we move from design at the guidance level to purchasing at the reference level. And at the appliance level, really the first work you have to do is to start deploying. The actual assembly is effectively plugging it into the wall and turning it on. There's a very small amount of steps. And as we said, example of that smaller appliance, it's 45 minutes from cardboard box to production. And so it really changes the dynamics of how you think about building a solution. So with appliances, the first real problem you have, other than making sure you have power and cooling, is deploying, starting to solve the problems associated with deploying that. Now, one of the things I also want to mention here is that in delivering specific appliances, the experience that's delivered with the appliance really varies based on what it's for. And so, for example, the experience around our business decision appliance is oriented around enabling information workers to start using Power Pivot immediately. So we try to eliminate all of the complexity that might be associated with that, so that at the very low level of, or very low cost, we're enabling those information workers to start immediately using Power Pivot. That's the goal, is to get them using that. Now with something like our consolidation or private cloud appliance, is a very different goal. We're trying to allow, usually our IT staff, we're trying to allow them to scale their skills to, first of all, save money by consolidating, but also become more agile and in being able to deliver more rapidly solutions to their customers, to the customers of the IT department. And so it's really enabling a whole different class of users in that case. And so there's a different experience. So one thing to keep in mind is not every appliance delivers exactly the same experience. In fact, one of the problems that we have to solve in building the appliance is understanding what experience we want to deliver. It's no different than the fact that we have SQL Server and it has management tools and there's a whole development environment. There's all those different experiences that we have to deliver. When we get to an appliance, we have a similar kind of problems. We have to understand the audience that is the target user for that particular appliance. So that's the concept of reference architectures and appliances. First question.
Back to that slide. For the green band, when you say you can buy that, is there a SKU for that?
Generally speaking, for the green band, there's not a SKU. What there usually is a bill of materials. The question was, the green band or vendor-specific reference configuration, is there a SKU? Can I just buy a single part number? Generally speaking, the answer to that is no. What you purchase usually is there may be a preset set of parts that you can shortcut to that, but usually it's not something that's manufactured, right? It's assembled on site at your location, almost always.
Like the parts list?
You get a parts list.
Configuration list and then a validation?
Effectively, there's a parts list that was created by using the guidance and then validated independently. That doesn't mean that the assembly that doesn't mean when you buy all the parts and assemble them, you're going to pass the same validation test. If you connect the cables in a different way, who knows what's going to happen. If you happen to buy slightly different drives or change the firmware version or whatever, there's no guarantee that you're going to get exactly the results as part of that. Although it's much more likely, right? You're dealing with the amount of risk. One way to think about it is the amount of risk in terms of the final implementation continues to drop. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yep.
Couple of questions. The first one is, I don't know if I can get it right. We have a competing with Microsoft and I know it's going to take some time, like that. On one side, you have PowerShell, information orchestration. That kind of have all the time. The other side, that is how much time we're going to save by deploying the other one is then comes the form of virtual apps, like the hyper-V or VM.
Yep.
Or is a standard approach for the just like that function exactly how Oracle? So where is it? From what I see now, it says some time.
Yep. So the question was, there's a lot of competing approaches here or value propositions. How should we think about it? There's time to deployment. There's the applicability to different solutions, and we've got such a range of possibilities from physical things to virtual things, and then there's different approaches. I think probably one. Yeah. So I think the value, and this gets to the point of what the value proposition of individual appliances are. In this case, for the business decision appliance that we've worked together with HP on, the idea is to deliver rapidly the whole Power Pivot experience in a way that's really usable in an enterprise environment. So the hardware we've selected, there's no for the mechanical components, there's no single point of failure. We've done a good job of making sure that it's integrated together, and the performance optimizations that have done in there are generally not known. They're known by experts in their individual areas, but the combined knowledge that's in that box is very hard to assemble. I don't know anybody who knows all that's in there, except perhaps Dana, who actually helped build it all. So that's part of the value of that particular one. But you're right. There are many different ways to get that value. One difference between you mentioned a virtual appliance model that's there, and that's interesting, and that's something I think is going to continue to grow in terms of demand. Marrying a concept that's materialized in the form of a VM with the appropriate hardware resources to make it work really well is still difficult. Today, it's really not possible to create a VM that has known performance characteristics in a very clear way. Exactly this level of service that it will provide. You can get close, and we're getting there, but we're not quite all the way there yet. But we're on that path. And so I think you are right. We're going to start to see some of this stuff evolve with some of the shared infrastructure environments that are out there. We got all kinds of questions now. Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Fortunately, in the case of Power Pivot, the data is not sourced there. It comes from somewhere else. So that all pre-exists. The security is not sourced there. That comes from somewhere else. In fact, that requires Active Directory. If you don't have Active Directory, it won't work. So your security infrastructure is a prerequisite. So some of those points you made we did not attempt to solve those problems in here precisely because we effectively have a dependency on those. Yeah.
So we have to still have to learn, still have to fit it in and do some manual labor.
That's true. If you turned on an appliance like that and everything in your organization was completely locked down and no one had access to anything other than, let's say, the current automation for reporting or something like that, the first things that would happen is customers would start to say, or the end users of that would start to say, hey, I need to get at this particular data. There's a lot of options in how to do that. With the, for example, you don't have to source the data by going directly into a database or a data mart or a cube. You could drive it off a report that was pre-generated. And so they would only touch the report. The same thing they would normally read in long form, they could actually take that data and use it for analysis. So there's ways to set it up there so there's no and you're right, that's not solved by this. So there is a learning process that you would have to go with a new workload.
I just want to say one thing. Don't get hung up with this appliance and this form factor. This is targeted at small to medium-sized businesses and enterprise, departmental, or POC deployments. If the target was enterprise, we would have architected it differently. Yeah. So you need to make sure that we're not trying to solve all the problems for everyone, right, but we're actually optimizing things for organizations that can use that form factor in that configuration.
Yes. So are you saying that there is an appliance for data warehouse? I'm just forgetting the name, like parallel data warehouse. So this can solve pretty much any area, like your database area, reporting area, analysis service, integration service, things like that? Yeah.
We'll go into this later. You can see the features that are in here. So,
but you're right, and in fact, you can combine them together to build solutions. That's actually precisely one of the points. Is if we carefully choose major problem spaces, then it is possible to actually connect the dots together and get that. So the example you raised is exactly a valid one, which is if your enterprise needs a very large database and you use our parallel data warehouse or what HP sells as the HP Enterprise Data Warehouse product, which is another one of the appliances I'll talk about, if you had that appliance, you could use this appliance to get Power Pivot up and running, connected to that as a data source. That absolutely could be done.
So the answer is that I know specifically for data warehouse it is there. So what you're saying that for other areas also, database, your, as I said, analysis service, integration service, there are different appliances available which can.
I'll walk through what our plans are. In fact, that's our very next item here is to update you on the roadmap. So exactly where we need to go. One more, and then we'll move on.
One real high-level question.
Yeah.
How do you engage in those services?
How do we engage?
How does a person like me, how do we engage in seeing if there's value for our organization in order to purchase appliances?
So the question was, how do you engage? And how do you know if appliance is right for you? Is that a right way to say it? Yeah. Well, the easy answer that I would give is simply get yourself a proof of concept box or go to one of our centers where we have these kinds of systems located and try one out. That's one example. For others, for the ones that we're building, if you're really interested in those, let us know. And because we are looking for customers that participate in our technology adoption program or TAP programs, beta programs, as part of those. So if you really see something here you're really passionate about, you think is applicable to you, we can engage on that level as well. So.
He's been waiting for a while.
Yeah.
What about the other the other vendors.
Well, we're working with multiple vendors. The appliance we have here is from HP, and the parallel data warehouse product that we've shipped is also available as the HP Enterprise Data Warehouse. So HP is a very close partner with us on these things. We are working with multiple vendors. We're not ready to talk about that yet. Okay. So let me go on and let's talk about the roadmap, specifically what's available right now. And in the data warehouse space, there's two directions that you can go right now. One is the enterprise data warehouse, and the second is the reference architecture around fast track data warehouse. How many people have heard of the fast track data warehouse reference architecture? And that's essentially with our hardware partners, and I think there's about 10 of them now. They've defined that vendor-specific configuration level reference architecture, and they've done the work to validate those and then make it possible for you to acquire them. Now, how you acquire them varies by the individual vendor, but they've done that level of work, and we've worked with them on that. The enterprise data warehouse is an appliance. It's available prepackaged. It's delivered already assembled. There's a final assembly and delivery process when it shows up there. And then, of course, the business decision appliance, which is right up front, that's available as well, and that comes completely pre-assembled. There's really no services required to finish that one. You got to plug in a few power cords and network cords, and it's can be active. So that's what's available right now. The next step here is we want to look at what's coming soon, and two particular things that we're expecting will be soon. One is a data warehouse appliance that's targeted at the low end or lower end, and so we'll talk about that a little bit. And the other one is a reference architecture around our private cloud. If you haven't heard yet, there is the Hyper-V Cloud reference architecture that's been at least initially published, and so that's out there. You can imagine our private cloud consolidation offering is really leverages that, in fact, in a big way. And so there's a relationship between what we'll provide in terms of this future reference architecture and what's already been published. So to get an idea of where we're going, that's certainly something that you can take a look at. Now, when we look a little further out, and I'm not going to give even specific time frames for these, a database consolidation appliance is something that we are actively working on right now. We have customers that have these units, and they're playing with them and giving us feedback on this. And then we're also working on what we call an enterprise transaction processing appliance, and that's something that we're not ready to really share a lot of details on, other than what we have in here. So that's a rough roadmap, if I go here, of the various things that we are building around reference architectures and appliances. The transaction processing will probably be available in both forms, along with consolidation. Business intelligence, we don't have plans right now to publish reference architectures, but that's something that could absolutely change, and we're certainly interested in your insights on that as well. So that's the roadmap. Any questions about roadmap? Okay, move on to the first element of it. Fast track data warehouse reference architecture. This is something that's out there today. We've got, I think, 10 different vendors that have systems that are conforming to this, and it's using the guidance level information that Microsoft provides. The vendor works with us to create the vendor-specific configuration level of that, and then makes that available. Generally speaking, if you buy one of these, you get a pile of boxes. In fact, in most cases, every single disk drive shows up in its own little separate box. So you unpack it all and assemble yourself. It's sort of the color by, or paint by numbers approach to building a system. The great thing about this is it has been validated for specific performance characteristics, and so you have an idea of roughly how this thing's going to work. Now, if you don't assemble it exactly the right way, you don't install and configure the software the exact right way, who knows how it's going to operate for there. So it's not delivered as an appliance, and it's not supported as an appliance. It's a system that you build. This is just a fast way for you to get it. We think this is very valuable to customers, and there's many customers building these kinds of systems now across the whole world, and something that we think will continue to be useful. The next appliance, let's go to example to one in the really high end, and I want to drill on one thing here to help you understand a little bit about appliances. This workload is targeted at really extreme scalability. We want to be able to have people build the most demanding transaction processing systems with valid HA and DR approaches that are proven in the lab to make sure that they work correctly. And so this kind of appliance, you can't buy it without HA. It only comes HA, and it's pre-configured and pre-assembled that way. The hardware is tuned and the software is configured so that it operates that way. What we're expecting is DR, in this case, would be an option that you would have on that. So you want HA, you would get this. If you need a high level of DR, then that would potentially be an incremental expense for this kind of an appliance. What's that? Actually, I'll get to that. I'll get to that a little bit in the discussion. The question was, what's the DR option? The truth is, we haven't exactly decided what it is yet. There's a bunch of them we're considering and playing around with. We probably will, in terms of an appliance experience, keep that to a small number of choices. But you could always use this as a building block and then create your own with you know, whatever you find is appropriate as well. So if you don't like what we do, you can take your own approach around that as well. Also, with this kind of an appliance, we think it's very important to have single call for support. And there's a support level that's only available on appliances called Premier Mission Critical. It's the highest level of support that you can get, and it's designed specifically for an appliance type experience. So that's another value here. Now, I wanted to use this as an example to drill into that. Remember when I talked about those four circles, I talked about architecture as one of the issues that we have to go in and understand that. And if you look at this particular appliance, there's some interesting things. The obvious solution would be to create a couple servers with some shared storage, and I'd have a failover cluster. That's the obvious solution. 95% of high-end HA systems are built that way. But given what we know about the forthcoming Denali product, there's a different architecture that we can propose. And you saw demos of this in the keynotes, the multiple secondary idea, where you can create particular collections of databases and have them be coordinated as a secondary on a separate server. That can be maintained synchronously. So when a transaction is committed on one server, it's committed on both servers. I can read both servers, so I can actually load balance my read traffic across them. We have a different way to think about it, right? We're not using, in that case, necessarily a shared SAN. Potentially, we don't need the SAN in between there anymore. We can use a different model for how we model storage. Could use SAN too, but it gives us flexibility. So that's a great example of where deep understanding of how the software works and the options, we can change our approaches or look at different architectural approaches and try to build something that's optimal. I can tell you this has a very deep impact in how we engineer. We've been working on this, and you can imagine if my team's understanding how this kind of appliance is going to operate, we then go back to the engineering team and say, hey, that multiple secondary thing, it has to really work in this way. And we can give them a very concrete example of how that's going to work, and they can use that to help them refine their view of how that feature might be used. So there is a nice feedback mechanism that occurs within the organization around that, and that's really interesting to see that happening. So there's an example here of how in our engineering process we uncover architectural questions, and then we can go through and answer them and come up with an approach that we think is suitable. We're not quite ready to talk about the details of what we decided on this yet. Hopefully, we'll be able to do that in one of the we'll do that very soon. So that's premium transaction processing. The second appliance we want to talk about also, we view it as a tier 1 appliance, but the tier 1-ness, if you will, is really around the service that it provides. The individual workloads that are running on this, which are hundreds to thousands of individual SQL Server instances, each one of those is not necessarily a tier 1 workload. So one of the things that we understand, and a lot of this been by talking with customers, is that when you start to aggregate all of that infrastructure into a consistent system, the reliability of that system, the requirements for reliability of the system goes way up. And so we have to make sure we build that in a way that recognizes that. So this appliance we view as a tier 1 appliance. It has that kind of support and infrastructure. We build the hardware in a way that has that mission critical aspect to it. But we also understand that we're not trying to host hundreds of tier 1 systems here. We're trying to host hundreds of the other systems that are there. Yeah, question.
Are you talking about instance consolidation or database consolidation?
Well, you can do either one, and the approach here in this appliance is to support very low cost, very low friction instance consolidation, and then within that environment allow you to do whatever consolidation you want to. So if you happen to be an organization that for whatever reason sliced your database up into very small fragments and scattered them out onto many, many servers, and in retrospect you say, maybe that was too far, you want to bring those all back together, the notion is it's not a prerequisite of this particular appliance that you do that. You can do it in either order. If you want to consolidate them and then bring them into the appliance, that's fine. If you want to first just bring them in and then worry about consolidating, that's fine also. Most people we talk to that are familiar with the details say, I want to solve my problem once I'm on the appliance, and the reason is the appliance is so powerful and has capacity that allows you to be able to flexibly make those choices. Often, these systems that are going to be consolidated are constrained by the individual memory and storage attributes that they have, or processing attributes. And the notion of taking on, in addition to the workload that's already there, handling some sort of migration process that's associated with that, that may itself overwhelm the particular system and destroy the performance. And so by bringing it into the consolidation infrastructure, effectively into your private cloud, you can use the elasticity attribute of private cloud and expand the resources associated with that so that you can handle the migration work that may be part of that. So and that's an interesting question. So consolidation, we're trying to reduce people's costs, and that can be in lots of different factors. Different people have different needs. In some cases, raw footprint, the actual physical space is the most important thing, and so there's benefits from that. In some cases, it's about power. I want to reduce my power footprint, and of course, along with that, my cooling footprint, and so that may be the driving force. In some cases, it's my DBAs are overwhelmed. I need to be able to help them scale. Give me some tools that will help my staff be able to take their skills and handle the onslaught of data that we see coming our way. So there's a real variety of ways that those are expressed here. We have a poster. In fact, this is what folks who are asking questions are getting, that tries to capture effectively all the complexity of this particular problem in one piece of paper. And the way to think about this particular, although we don't say it on here, this is really the approach or the reference architecture from a guidance perspective. This is a poster of that, is one way to think about it, of how we are going about database consolidation. So if you want to get a good idea of what the environment's going to be like, in the eventual appliance, look at this and you're going to get a really good idea from that. And there's a tremendous amount of work that's gone into collecting all the pieces and parts here, if you will, figuring out how to integrate them and optimize them so that we can build that kind of a solution. Let's jump on next to data warehouse appliances, and we've talked about this to a fair degree already, but I want to use this as a great illustration of how a family of appliances can fit together. In fact, how a family of appliances and reference architectures can all fit together. And if you look at just a very simple view of data warehousing, there's a lot of different needs out there. You've got the needs of a small or medium business, could be a departmental data warehouse. You've got the enterprise data warehouse problem. I need massive scale. And then even within that, I may want to have something even more than that. I want to surround that massive data warehouse with hub and spoke, using a hub and spoke architecture, so a multi-tier kind of story. So the range of needs that are within that are really immense. And it really brings about an understanding of a family of solutions that are needed. So one of the things that we've done in terms of understanding that is we certainly understand you can go build your own solutions and have an approach to do that. We've taken, and here's some examples from HP in terms of specific configurations that they offer around Fast Track that are in there. Then, of course, at the very high end of your hundreds of terabytes, you've got the enterprise data warehouse appliance. One of the things we're working right now on is a smaller appliance. I really don't want to call it low end or small in that sense. Turns out a 5 terabyte data warehouse is non-trivial, but this appliance is a way to solve that problem that's very cost effective. And so we've learned a lot in terms of how to build these kinds of systems over time, and we're taking all that knowledge and essentially embedding it into a very simple experience. I can tell you, for example, I'm sorry?
It says /5, 380, 580, and 980 /5. What does that 5 mean?
I suppose that means 380, 385, which are two different model numbers. Yeah. I didn't invent those numbers, so. Yeah, there's a whole ton of information out there if you want to get into. Just go look on Fast Track Data Warehouse and you'll find all the configurations that are published. But here's an example where we've looked at data warehousing and understood the various, if you will, points along the dial that make sense, and we created products around that to help with that. Some appliances, some reference architectures, and in some sense, this is really the most mature workload relative to appliances because it's kind of the first one in the industry to kind of move that way, and data warehousing overall has shifted towards an appliance model the first, and we think many other of the workloads that you're all familiar with are also going to make similar shifts over time, and part of that is because of the value around that. So that's data warehouse solutions. I want to finish up really talking about our business decision appliance so you get an idea of the process that we go through in creating such an appliance. So I have a little more of a drill down into that. First of all, just if you're not familiar, what we're trying to do here is solve a problem that we see at many places, and that's this, if you will, tension between the desire of information workers to gain deep insight into the business data they have and the requirement that IT has to have as oversight and governance of all that information. And so there's a tension between those two, and we talked about that even earlier. So balancing those needs is something that we had to understand inherently, and in doing that, at a general level, came up with a solution around technology called Power Pivot. Power Pivot is an Excel add-in. It lets information workers do deep analysis of very rich data sets. You've seen the demos at the general sessions. And there's also a component of that around SharePoint. So the client side of that is really focused on the insight piece, as well as delivering that same experience via a browser, via Excel services. But on the server side is really where we have oversight, and that's where building into SharePoint the ability to keep track of all these different Power Pivot workbooks, where their data is from, allowing them to be refreshed, allowing you to get deep insight into who's using them, how often, how important they are. Effectively, you can start to understand, even though these assets effectively are being created by information workers with Excel knowledge, you can start to get insight driven by the data as to what's really important to the business. So you can track who's using what, and essentially the good stuff's going to bubble to the top. We actually saw a picture of that, or an example of that, in the animation demo that we did as part of the general session. So that's basically the problem that we had. To solve that, we created an appliance, and we did that for a specific reason. One was the complexity of assembling all the parts back to the original why on appliances really was there. There's a dozen components that need to be fit together appropriately, and being able to do that is non-trivial. And so we created this solution to solve that problem, and it's used really in a bunch of different ways. As we mentioned, at the departmental level, in very large enterprises, you can use it as a departmental solution. For a small and medium business, this might be your whole BI solution. That might be it, and you could run potentially everything on this solution. And we see things are all over the map in terms of how people view this as a potential building block for their own solutions. I was just talking to someone in the conference, and when they viewed this, it was like, listen, I can buy one. I have 5 businesses that I deal with on an everyday basis. I could buy one of these for each of those 5 businesses, and even though my SharePoint upgrade to SharePoint 2010 is not going to be finished for another year, they can be productive next week using Power Pivot with this, and that's a way for me to deliver. In their case, it was a way for them to deliver that experience very rapidly, and so that was attractive to them. For others, it's, I don't have the skills in my IT organization to install and deploy any of this stuff. If I got to bring in outside people, it's going to cost me more than the cost of the hardware just to pay someone to come do it. It makes complete sense. Effectively for them, day one they use this, it's actually paying for itself. So there's different motivations there. So this is an example of that solution. Now, how did we get there? What we went through in understanding the workload, putting all the parts together, here's an example of the kind of benchmarking that we would do. Run the workload on in this case, it actually is on pretty close to the target hardware to understand what processor memory disk was needed. And in this case, we've got a fairly complex workbook being used by 65 concurrent users, and understanding that workload of that on the actual appliance. And as you can see, well, there's all different kinds of things they do here. The purple line at the top is actually randomly they do different operations. So every once in a while, someone goes and redraws what they call the gallery, which are those really nice renderings of all of the workbooks. That's a fairly expensive job to render all that because it's real-time rendering. And so that's a little more expensive. So that took, on average, about 2 seconds or 2.5 seconds here. But the rest of it is all the transactions are basically at the bottom. We're getting sub-second response time in the system, and is working extremely well. We're able to understand what the CPU utilization is around this, and really model how this would be. So there's an example where we've understood the workload. We created a model, an executable model. Then we can start to run it on the target system that we have and tune it. Not only using this, but understanding the various parts that were there. In fact, the very first paper design, if you will, for the hardware had actually significantly more memory in it than we did. And we were able to use this modeling to understand, okay, we actually don't need that much memory in there to support the target for this thing. So we reduced the total in there and, of course, lowered the cost as a result of that. If you don't know that and you buy it all up front before you've ever figured it out, you just either have way too much memory in the box, or worse, you never put enough in to start with, and you don't realize that you're limited by that. And so we're able to take the full spectrum and test all the various ways in between and figure it out and capture that as for you. So that's an example there. Now, once we've done that work and finalized the solution, we work with our partners and come up with a way to deliver it to customers. And here's an example. When you turn the thing on, what's the experience going to be? We don't want it to be, you've got to answer every single question from every single piece of software we install. That's 12 different pieces of software. That's an awful lot of clicks and typing. We try to eliminate all that and consolidate it to the very minimum conversation that's necessary. And here's an example of that screen where we capture the appliance name, some domain credentials, so that you can do that. There's about 5 of these screens that you have to go through to configure the appliance before it's available for use. Yes?
Because it's based on Windows Server or Windows Server Core, do you use Core or regular?
That particular server is based on Windows Server.
But we evaluate core. If we can use core, we will use core, right?
Oh.
So.
And then with that, how do you handle, like, are there patches and whole maintenance thing?
Oh, servicing is a great question. So the question is, how do you deal with servicing? On the Tier 2 appliances, we make sure that out of the box, they configure themselves to get their servicing information from your own internal WSUS infrastructure, or go right out, if you don't have that, go right out to the internet and pull patches down. In fact, machine, before it's even usable, will be fully patched. And so we'll make sure that's the case. And we go through a lot of effort to make sure it's not exposed at all during that process. For example, when you turn it on at first, even though everything's kind of on there, we lock the machine down, and then we progressively unlock it as we get it secure, as we turn on the appropriate security measures. And we review that whole process with a security team at Microsoft to make sure we're conforming to the standards that are out there. So that's certainly part of it, and that's sort of a key part of what we do. In theory, if this machine was attacked to the naked internet, it's not something that could be attacked because of the way we do that.
So you mentioned that each individual hard drive comes in separate. Does it already have data?
Oh, that's in the case of a reference configuration. In the case of a reference configuration, you're not buying an appliance, okay? You're getting a bunch of parts that you assemble yourself. In that case, it's all in parts. When you buy an appliance, there's only one box or one crate, and in the case if it's a rack, you uncrate it, roll it out, and roll it into your data center. If it's an appliance like that, it literally is in a box and it's all in there. So yeah, there's really only one thing to unwrap. It's pre-assembled in the factory, and we work with the hardware manufacturers to make sure that that can happen, to figure out how to do that, and of course they're experts in how to ship these things and do that. So we have, different size appliances have different experiences there, but in no case, if it's appliance, are you assembling it. If it's a reference architecture, you get a pile of boxes. That's what you get from those. Let you know, the experience is not only getting it ready and to use, but then once you're going to turn it over to your end users, what's it going to look like? Out of the box, the appliance is set up with its own SharePoint site, so it knows what the users need to do, and all the information they might need to go get the Power Pivot plugin, let's say, to use in Excel, is all right here at their fingertips, and then they can go start creating their own workbooks. So the easy scenario is you do your installation in 45 minutes. You go into this screen. You click on that button there that says email these links. You type in the name of the DL of the people, the distribution list of the people that you want to use it. Press send, and you're done. They go off and do their thing, and it pretty much manages itself. Keeps track of who's doing what, keeps track of who's using what resources, and you can go look at that when you wish to. So that's an example of that kind of scenario. Yes? You have a question? No? Oh, okay. In the back.
This has SQL Server 2008 R2.
Yes.
From a DBA's perspective, what do we have to do to manage it?
From a DBA perspective, there really is a minimum amount of work you need to do. It's designed to be to take care of itself. You have to make sure it's backed up. You have to have a recovery strategy that makes sense. That's really the focus there. All of the tools that you normally have, though, to look at and understand how a database is operating and the rest of that are all available. So you can apply all of your knowledge to this if that's necessary. If it's not, it's designed out of the box with all the best practices. So it's not like you got to go in and spend a lot of time on it. You could spend a lot of time on it if you decided that that was worth your time. So, yes?
So the appliances all come with storage. Is Microsoft considering going a different route and selling an appliance where you can leverage the existing SAN infrastructure at
Yep.
operation, just given specs to a certain amount of IOPS that you need?
Yep. So the question was, the appliances we've talked about so far all have embedded storage. What about that, the possibility? We do understand that. We hear, generally speaking, we believe if we provided the solutions without storage, they would tend to fail. That's the dominant case that we hear out there. So we're providing at least our initial round of appliances with built-in storage. It's all pre-configured. That doesn't mean you can't use your SAN. You can certainly connect your SAN to it if you wish. You're certainly going to put backups and things like that in your normal infrastructure around that. But out of the gate, the idea is the storage is already pre-designed to handle what's necessary there. I think that's something we'll continue to consider, and we're looking for feedback on that. The difficult part in terms of delivering a guaranteed experience is how that works, how that can work. And so we'll have to evolve to get there. Sort of generation one, if you will, the idea is to go in with a complete solution. And I think just like the question earlier around virtual appliances, it's related to that in terms of what service level can we guarantee for a solution.
Because it seems like once you go down this route, you lose the ability to use some of the higher-end storage replication type functionality that you get with the SAN when it's all local storage.
Yeah. Well, that's true. Although for this particular workload, that's not that important. Replicating the IOPS that are inside this box is probably not. I mean, it's a bunch of workbooks. So
I'm just saying appliances in general.
yeah. For the higher end servers, like for example the transaction processing server, the IOPS requirements are beyond what we understand how to deal with in normal SANs. So we're trying to understand that particular problem as well. We're learning. We're going through that process.
You also have the problem with consistency, right? Britt and I were at SQL Connections, and I remember exactly the guy came up and said, "Man, I spent 3 weeks detailing how the SAN should be set up to use the database in a certain configuration. I gave it to my storage guys. It took them another 2 weeks. They didn't do it the first time. I had to go ask them again, and then they just created the area for us. They didn't do any of the optimizations, right? And so to put these appliances in, they really are tailored to specific performance, and it's a struggle for some companies that are using SANs for their databases to get that. So.
In the back.
For the appliances that are available today, the ones that we are using, are they going to be time to market with the SQL 2011 launch?
Question is, how do we think about the appliances relative to the launch of SQL 11 or Denali, as we talked about it here? The detailed plans around that are not set yet, but we certainly are quite well aware of Denali and looking at those issues. So we're not ready to talk about that yet.
Follow-up question, your old appliance that you said is really early on in the process.
Yeah.
Would you kind of classify that as a competitor to Exalogic from Oracle?
I wouldn't really think of it relative to Exalogic. I think of more around Exadata.
Is it Exadata? Okay.
Yeah. Let me move on and have a couple more slides, and then we can finish up with questions. One of the things that we also want to configure or consider when building an appliance is what the management experience is. And in the particular case of this appliance, what made sense, given SharePoint was a dominant piece of infrastructure on here, was to make sure that we integrated in with a SharePoint administration console. So we added very specifically, you can see at the top here, appliance management as some of the configuration or some of the management tools that are there. And so, for example, you can use that. You can go through that and back up the whole appliance via that mechanism. In fact, the appliance comes pre-configured with storage in such a way that you can back up the appliance onto itself to start with. So literally, when you're done with that first 45 minutes, you can back up the work you just did, and then start working on, okay, what's my DR story with this, and relative to plugging it into your own environment. Once you get that solved, we have information that lets you know, fine, I don't need the online onboard backups anymore. I can return that storage back to the appliance, and then it will use it locally. And so you can set up that kind of model with it. So it's flexible that way. One other point is, we also have the ability to reset the appliance back to its factory state. So it's as though you never did anything to it. So it's possible, if it's important to you, you can get one of these, play around with it, and reset it and do it for real, if you will. And it doesn't. That's not a problem. It turns out that's important if you're an ISV and have customers that you might want to do proof of concepts with, or those kind of things. That's something that's enabled by this as well. So even if you're an IT organization that wants to let different business units try this stuff, it's a way to actually take a very simple solution, get it up and running, let them try it, and then you can redeploy it to the next one, after they sign up to get that particular solution. Last point here around this is we have the appliances all come with management packs that know about the appliance, and so it understands how all the pieces are put together, and there's a knowledge here. We create what's called a unified health model for the appliance. So you understand if it's working, not the individual piece in parts, which is usually the way it is, but there's a unified model for the entire thing. And so that can be really helpful in terms of understanding whether or not there really is something that has to be done on it. For example, some of our appliances have a lot of spares in the way they're configured. Their storage is configured. If one spare fails, or one spindle fails and a spare takes over, it's just not a big deal. You don't need to be concerned about it. Most management consoles, red lights go on, a drive failed. You need to understand how important that is relative to all the other problems that you have, and we're able to provide that health model as part of it. This slide I provided just to capture some of the words I've got in here, and I've got a bunch of resources in here as well that are part of that I'm not kind of gonna go through here. And I even have slides that the folks at the conference put in here for me for resources for you. Anyway, I'll finish up my comments here, and then we can go to questions on asking you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about this. Please submit your evaluations of this. We really want to get your feedback. And then why don't we open it up to general questions? Yes?
Data warehouse, maybe there's some reporting. What do you find as far as the test environment? Are you responsible for that, or do you give them some guidance on this is what the test environment needs to be? And see, oh, it works fine in test, I move it to here to production, and it doesn't work the same because testing.
Yeah. So the question is, with an appliance, how do you deal with test environments? And that is something that we have to think about. In the simple cases, simpler appliances. And the object here is workbooks. You can test workbooks on the appliance without needing a separate appliance. So you can develop a workbook, test it, all the rest of that, without putting it into production as part of that. So that's something that can be done there. If you need a whole other level of testing beyond that, you might require two appliances, have a test appliance as part of that. With some of the larger appliances, like let's say database consolidation, our thought there is that's a scale-out model. So you buy as much as you need. You could buy a second, smaller version, much smaller version of that solution and use that as a test environment if you needed to have something that was there. So you know, that's kind of it. You could go out and try to rebuild your own thing, but then how close is that going to be to the actual appliance environment? I don't know. That's certainly possible. And all the products we've talked about here today, with the exception of Parallel Data Warehouse, use standard software components. And so we're not, you know, we're building stuff that way. Parallel Data Warehouse there is a specific piece of software that knows about massive parallel data warehousing that runs on that particular solution, and so that's very specialized from that perspective. Yes?
In case of the database consolidation appliance, they plan to use a Hyper-V for virtualization?
Yes, the question was for database consolidation, what's the architecture? And fundamentally, the architecture is Hyper-V based virtualization using a System Center infrastructure to manage all that. And so System Center Virtual Machine Manager and all of its various components are used as part of that.
Is the plan to, for example, use VMware or something like that?
The question is there a plan to use VMware? No. There's no plan to use VMware as part of that. However, certainly the work's being done to make sure that you can import VMware VMs into the environment, so that's not an issue. So if you have an existing VMware environment and you'd like to move into a database consolidation appliance model, you can certainly move. If your systems are already virtualized or a portion of them are, there's certainly no barrier to being able to do those kinds of migrations.
The knowledge of the IT people in the VMware technologies and Hyper-V.
Yeah, no, I understand. I understand. So with that, I'll wrap up the official stuff, and we'll be available for questions up front here. We have an actual appliance on the table. You can come take a look at it and touch it. And thanks very much for hanging in there. It's been a pleasure.